Hi, everyone. I'm Tjaša Pogačar. I'm the curator of a project that we commissioned from Nascent, but also part of the Project Atol team and Shum Journal team as well. I'll just say I'm really happy that you all could join us today here in real life and also online. I'll just briefly present Nascent, so Paul Zeidler and Max Hampshire, and just say like 2 sentences about the framework of this project, and then hand it over to Wasim to continue. So Nascent is an exit tech production studio investigating alternative infrastructures and delving into the nature of games, economics, and consensus systems. With that, they create theory-based computational experiments and tools to prototype technological secessionism and spark discussion about the base layers of current stacks. Paul is a Berlin-based artist and researcher exploring economic systems, arithmetics, and formal languages. And Max is a technical writer and researcher based in Vienna, working on experimental minimum viable systems, privacy, and novel temporalities. We invited Max and Paul to contribute a new project or piece for a platform we're running together with Project Atol and Shum, which is called Plaza Protocol, and that is also the site where their project will be available and accessible after this event. And the launch event is actually kind of organized by the 0x Salon and Wasim Al-Sindi. I'm really glad that you managed to bring them aboard, Max and Paul. Thank you so much. And it's called somehow like Temporal Secessionism Edition, because Temporal Secessionism is also a series in which the Time Zone 4, which is the name of the project for Project Atol and Plaza Protocol, is part of. Yes, that's it. And then I think Wasim can take over and tell us a little bit more about 0x Salon and how this will continue.
Sure, yeah. So I'll just say something really quick about the Salon, then I'll hand it back to Max and Paul. We could talk about temporal secessionism and the Time Zone 4 project that they're launching now. So yeah, my name is Wasim, and yeah, I'm in cyberspace. So like, there's kind of like two tentacles to this event. There's the Ljubljana tentacle and there's the cyber tentacle. And so we are disembodied heads on sticks on Zoom today. There'll be between 15 and 20 people joining us. The idea with the 0x Salon is to provide a space for intimate and kind of free-flowing discourse on unusual topics. And so the idea is that we get all kinds of different people together with very varying backgrounds, and we talk about go through paths less traveled, unusual topics, and try to yeah, go beyond, let's say, scratching the surface and going beyond the hype. Might be zeitgeist topics, might be timeless topics. We've covered things like memes, Bitcoin's ecological impact, abstraction, interdisciplinarity, the limits of computational modeling of ecosystems, the virus. So we've been all over the place. And one of the things that we try to do, we use this discourse rule called Chatham House. So the conversations are basically behind closed doors for the most part. This is an exception, being a broadcast edition. And so one of the things we started doing was we wanted to chronicle and share the proceedings of the salon, the conversations we have with everybody that couldn't be there, couldn't be in the room for whatever reason. So we started producing outputs, like a mixture of pedagogical and artistic outputs. They can be written, they can be sound, can be like poetic critiques, something more textual, like reports. We've been making computer games, images out of GANs, and all the rest of it. And most recently, we started like a research residency, like an artist residency series, and we've got our first cohort going through now. I'm delighted to say that all 5 of those people are joining us today, and we'll be hearing from them in due course. So that's where we're at the moment, and this is the first time we've collaborated with an international organization. So most of the work we've done has been either in Berlin or our kind of like through our own existing networks in cyberspace. We did work a little bit with Alliance of the Southern Triangle on a few salons, and one of the members of that group, Diane Bauer, is with us today. But this is the first time that we've done kind of a wider scale that we got away from Diane there. Hi, Diane. And this is the first time we've done like a larger scale collaboration. So it's really nice to work with our project Atol, Shum, Plaza Protocol, Chasa, and all the lovely people over in Ljubljana. And so I guess like hand it back to Paul and Max, and they can say something about time zone 4. And I'll just say that the reason this salon came together is because we were discussing time anyway in the salon. It's one of the current topics under the kind of the rubric of transcendental time machines, which I'm sure we'll get into the origins of that reference a bit later. And we also recorded a podcast, Max, Paul, myself, and Martina Kavlot, one of the research residents. So if you're looking for more, if you looking to see how we ended up here as we kind of went through our kind of epistemic journey on this topic, that'd be a good place to look. And there's everything is archived on our website at 0xsalon.pubpub.org. And back over to Max and Paul. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Wasim. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off. We're going to kick this off by presenting, as you can see on the screen, time zone number 4. So this is the 4th in a series of alternate temporal systems or instantiations of that Paul and I have been working on with contributions from people like Amy, who I can see below me. Hey, Amy. And yeah, really kind of looking at these different techno-social processes that can be seen as producing time. And time zone 4 is another time zone that we've kind of worked on in this series. But before I go into what time zone 4 is, I'm going to kind of try and start explaining the root of the project itself, because that is a very abstract way to introduce what these things actually are. So temporal secessionism started off as a piece that we were asked to do, or that we produced for the 7th Athens Biennial, and also for the 34th Ljubljana Biennial as well, which was entitled Iskra Delta, which just finished. And what these pieces basically were is it was a proposal to kind of try and create 3 physically rooted but otherwise kind of digitally mediated, like alternate time zones or alternate kind of points around which new time systems would flow. And these were based on 3 different things: energy time, healing time, and what we call machine time. And basically energy time was trying to transcribe the flow of time according to transactions and blocks as they occurred in the Bitcoin blockchain into well, all of these things. We were basically trying to take these very abstract time systems and instantiate them in a way that made them a bit more human readable, essentially. So trying to transpose the flows of time in these systems onto the face of the clock that we kind of all know. And yeah, so energy time, we were basically looking at how we could, track time according to unsigned transactions and new blocks in the Bitcoin blockchain. Healing time was an attempt to, basically use the alternating fluctuations of a quartz crystal to try and kind of mediate the passage of time. And the machine time was a mapping of the way that time is produced according to Paxos, which is basically the algorithm that is used inside Google's data centers to keep all of its data centers in sync. So yeah, like I said, this is kind of the original proposal, and what we're actually showing you now are pages from what we call the Temporal Secessionism source book. So as part of time zone 4, as well as this new time zone, which I'll explain in a bit, we also kind of created a source book, so kind of a world building source book for other people to hack on and create their own temporal secessionisms.
Yeah, maybe to add to this, this kind of like proposal resulted in these kind of sculptures you can see here. There are now, I think, 5 sculptures produced, and they are exhibited in the Athens Biennial as well as the Ljubljana Biennial of Graphical Arts. And what's in, or maybe something about the kind of casing or about the kind of like look of them, which is interesting, is that they're like also have these stickers on them, which are kind of produced by an archive of essentially dead cryptocurrencies or like material from it's basically sourced of cryptocurrency projects which sort of like died in 2016 and 2017. So they almost like present kind of like a future which actually never happened in a way. They're like also in a strange way like really anachronistic to like graphic design. And we also produced for MFRU like a video which is kind of has also a lot of textual input of Amy. And anyhow, there's a lot of textual input of Amy, which she maybe can talk about later a little bit. But we essentially ask to if there could be some sort of like generative kind of poetic system, which can be kind of linked to the clocks and so create almost like a textual flow, which then would sort of like work as an entry point for the whole experience of these certain time zones.
And so, yeah, without further ado, now we've kind of placed it in a bit of context. We want to present Time Zone 4 for the first time, which is a, there we go. Oh, no, wait, sorry. Let's go to the book. So, yeah, so basically, as part of Time Zone 4, we have the Temporal Secessionism source book, which actually turned into a relatively long publication. As you can see, it's 199 pages there. This was, again, designed really nicely by Johannes Wilke. And I think what we'll do now is we'll just kind of, we'll just cut through like the contents of this. So first of all, we have the 3 pieces that Amy wrote, which were kind of fragmented and then displayed on the digital displays of the objects that we have already kind of gone over. So she basically wrote 3 pieces, one for each of the kinds of time, the sources of temporal production that we were trying to show visually as well. So here we have energy time and also healing time and machine time, which if you don't read anything else from it, read those because they're great. And this, the source book was kind of an attempt to top and tail, conceptually top and tail the project. So it was an attempt to both highlight some of the kind of the deeper theoretical research that had gone into the production of the objects themselves that was kind of existing and that we wanted to present, but then also as a way of, essentially also giving some of our reflections on the project after we've been working on it for quite a while. So one of the other pieces that was included, which was quite core to our theoretical research, was New Time Machines Working Group by Kia Krutler, as well as an interview that we did. Oh no, okay, that's afterwards. There's also an interview with Anna Greenspan, but I got it in the wrong order. And then we asked Wasim to, basically write a chunk about some of the interesting temporal abnormalities that proof of work and proof of stake systems can bring into the picture from a more of a technically oriented perspective. And yes, then we also did an interview with Anna Greenspan, whose PhD thesis, Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine, was really key to kind of the genesis of just, the base theoretical idea that's behind the project. There's also a piece by us as well, which are our kind of theoretical reflections on how distributed systems and blockchain technology kind of brings about what we dub as maybe a novel temporal regime. So kind of maybe an update to the position that Greenspan put forward when she was talking about the kind of Y2K era of cyber time.
And of course, every art piece today is not finished if there is no like NFT attached. So we definitely need to do like I mean, it kind of makes sense in a way that like these kind of we talk a lot about like temporalities and also about obviously like distributed systems. And while the other pieces were more like sculptural and had sort of like an instantiation in a sort of really spatial place. We were interested in like looking into, okay, what would it mean to build essentially this kind of like infrastructural pieces, but having them almost as code in a sense, right? Having them almost like on chain and as kind of like autonomous, or kind of like a thing which doesn't have any dependencies, so to say. So we were interested in looking, or how to visualize essentially the time which a block takes to get mined. So the block time, which is changing all the time and is really depending also on the volume and on the traffic. And on obviously how much people are at the moment like mining, or like using essentially the network. And this is always like fluctuating, as you can see here. So this is now for the Ethereum mainnet, and it's like between, I would say like 12 seconds and like 13, 14 seconds. And I think it goes even more up now. And we looked into, okay, through what kind of like systems, also what kind of like visual representations we could sort of visualize these, but also do this in a way that the code itself would like generate the visualization. So not using like Solidity as a language for pure contract design, but like almost treating it as a language for generation of visuals, which is an approach which is not that much done, I think. And it's sort of interesting because it really plays with the material itself. So I will not go that much into the technique of it, but like essentially like everything is generated in the Ethereum virtual machine. There's no other dependencies of this kind of contract. So the machine itself renders the SVG, and the machine itself gets also the data from the chain. So it's a kind of like really self-contained system in a sense. And yeah, the good thing is if you query this, it almost like writes for you the format itself, right? It writes for you an SVG, and that doesn't need to be anyhow reproduced, or it doesn't need to be rendered in a sense, because it's already sort of like rendered in a contract. So we kind of found this visual system which we kind of developed, and it's kind of an SVG animation, which I can't show you because it's not SVG is not supported in this presentation, but I can give you the contract address, which you can look up, and I can maybe also just open the OpenSea page, right? Yeah. So this is how they look in reality, and they sort of sync up over time. So they have all their own like rhythm in the end, in the beginning, and sort of like sync up over time. And these are also, sort of a nice way to visualize a lot of the, I think, theory we talked about.
Yeah. So the essentially the rhythm, or the metro that the this kind of falling and expanding that you're seeing in each of these tokens is essentially the median kind of block time since the initial block that each of these NFTs was minted in, and the block time, the current block time. So as Paul was saying, they kind of are wildly different initially because the median between these points is actually wildly different, and then over time they slowly sync up as everything kind of shrinks together.
Maybe like another interesting point is that the metadata is really like generated on chain all the time. So if you change the metadata, just do it here and see if it will work. The speed of them might actually change because the speed of the chain itself might change, and or the block time might change. Let's see if this works. This is the presentation thing. Yeah, not really, maybe. Yeah, maybe a bit.
Okay. Yeah, and with that, thank you for that. Was kind of the end of our presentation. So we will pass over back to you, Wasim.
Yeah, cool stuff, guys. I wondered, like, when you were talking about that, you're talking about how you're rendering out the SVGs and like it's all being done on chain. And this is kind of like, it's not that common. And one of the reasons, I guess, is because it costs quite a lot of money to transact on Ethereum these days. But this is kind of like natively machinic art or something like that. There's nothing going in from outside the system here. It's all contained. Everything's being generated by the parameters of the Ethereum blockchain and whatever's inside the contract, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and then the actual, I mean, all of the computation as well is actually being kicked out to people who run nodes. So yeah, it's actually kind of purely, everything is completely ensconced within the machine. So we've tried to keep it as within the network as possible, which I think we've managed to do. Yeah.
I think that's the true spirit of crypto art, right? We're using the possibilities, affordances, and the idiosyncrasies of the medium, of the substrate, as best we can.
I mean, there might be one interesting point, which is essentially that like certain functions in Solidity are kind of like free to use, right? Because they're like view functions, so you can use them to do like pretty much arbitrary computation, which is kind of an interesting point because everything is sort of like incentivized, but these functions are sort of like free. So then it's a question who's doing the computation for these functions. But that's probably like a little bit too kind of detailed discussions about it. But I still think there are like this interesting sort of like points about these systems which seem to be incentivized, but like then certain things are not. And yeah.
Are you telling me that the art world is pushing its externalities onto the commons and making it more tragic? I'm shocked.
Yes.
So should we start? Maybe we'll zoom back out, and try to grok where we are as humans regarding time. And I will share the slides. 1 second, I'll dig them out. Where have they gone? Ah, there you are. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen. And I'll just move to present mode. Great. Yeah. So just to remind you again that if you want to ask questions but you don't want to jump in on the microphone, go to this website slido.com and put in this code 978552. There's also a link in the Zoom chat, which will take you straight there, and you can add questions at your convenience. And well, it's not working as well as it should. I will just refresh this. Again. Okay, not working as it should. That's fine. So yeah, as we said earlier, so this is like Temporal Secessionism edition, and it's a very light tweak of a set of conversations that we had recently, which were under the rubric of transcendental time machines. We already referred to Diana Greenspan, her PhD thesis, a couple of times. And so yeah, we're going to talk about time, duration, weird temporalities. One of the places it seems like not such a terrible place to start is to kind of like, well, from the start. Like, we are humans. We've been living by the sun and the moon as kind of like very coarse clocks since, literally since time began. And we have been building devices to measure time. And those have been getting more and more sophisticated as society has developed or progressed or whatever. And so, yeah, here are a few just kind of like overview points that we might choose to route the conversation through. And I thought I would just give like maybe a 5-minute pod history of timekeeping as quickly as we can go, really. And so, yeah, the sun has been rising and setting in the sky longer than humans have been around. So that has been a very coarse clock for us, right? There's daytime and there's nighttime. The moon also, does its thing periodically, and we can look back at very early records kept by humans, and then like the sacred rites and early religions were largely based off these kind of like calendric systems. And so we all know about sundials, ways to keep the time while the sun is shining. But obviously when it's dark, they're not so useful. Also, as the seasons shift, the amount of daylight that you get per day is also moving around. So the sundial is only reliable to give you kind of like gradations in the daytime, at least a primitive one. Water clocks, just using like the flow of water via gravity to give you kind of like a fairly general way of measuring flow, like flow of water, flow of time, and a sense of course progress, been used. I think the earliest water clocks purported to have come out of China about 10 or 11,000 years ago, but most of the records that we've got in the West come from things a bit closer to home, Greece and the like. And so in the Middle Ages, we started getting mechanical clocks, gears, cogs, and weights being like, so basically they would have like large weights and they would be pulled down through gravity. In a kind of, obviously gravity is also working in this kind of predictable and deterministic sense at the classical scale. And so that was also giving you something that you could, inverted commas, set your watch by. But these things were not hugely accurate to start with. I'm thinking about the first few clocks that ended up in northern Italian towns, like the churches would have built, and rituals around ancient and modern religions are both work off the clock and the calendar, right? And I know less about Christianity than I do about Islam. Islam is very much on the both the lunar and the solar calendars. So the lunar calendars give you the months, and the phases of the moon tell you when, for example, the month of fasting is over and the festival starts. But also the sun will tell you what time you're supposed to pray. And so the clock and the calendar have been kind of regimenting our lives for quite a while. And I suppose we'll take a step back into the Middle Ages, then maybe into the Industrial Revolution, when the clocks started getting better. We had better materials to make them, better tools, so then precision would have increased. But then there was also kind of a question mark about time and power started coming to the fore. So the earliest mechanical clocks might have been used to regulate social order for things like curfews in towns, and they would have also been used to further start to regiment workers' time, as Anna Greenspan spoke about quite a lot in her thesis. So as the clock gets more and more sophisticated, more efficient, and more precise, then the ability of the wielders of capital to use the clock as a tool to extract further productivity from their labor for control is also there. And I suppose we can take a hop, skip, and a jump towards the present. Now we've got obviously very precise electronic clocks. The picture that we were looking at the start, this picture is purportedly the most accurate clock in the world. It's an atomic clock. So you've been hearing about atomic clocks for a while, which work on, there'll be like a radioactive element in there and that will decay. It's a random process, but there's lots of atoms in there. So it kind of averages out into stochastically into an exponential, and you can fit that exponential to give you a very accurate clock. The picture on the screen now is the latest development of those atomic clocks. So this is not even measuring the radiative decay of an atom. It's not even measuring the vibration of the atom, which was the next step of atomic timekeeping. This is measuring the vibrations of the nucleons, of the neutrons and the protons inside the nucleus, which is many orders of magnitude smaller than the atom itself. And this clock, this thorium, I think it's a thorium clock, can keep time to within a second for the entire life of the universe, like well under a second. So it seems like we've got pretty good clocks now. So maybe we should just stop. Like maybe the story of time is over and we've done it all. I suppose there's one last thing to say, which is those were all kinds of single points, like atomic is a bad word to use in this case, but atomized clocks. But now we have networked societies, the internet, distributed systems, computers, blockchains, and the like. And so there's an element of needing some kind of networked time, some kind of more universal time that you can, everyone around the world can set their watches by. At first, that was started off as things like railway time, as the railways started getting built in Europe and the States and in Asia. And then there was a conference to decide how to do global time zones. And at that time, there was a country that was in the particular ascendancy, so they got to put the prime meridian through their backyard, and that's in Greenwich in London. And I suppose the last point to make about network time is, this is something that I was reading David Rooney's About Time, which is a really nice book by the former curator of the Greenwich Observatory timekeeping collection. And he made the point that GPS is basically a bunch of clocks in space. and everything is basically set via this requirement to know the time precisely. That's how you get your position. And so almost everything is running off GPS now, like all of our phones, tanks, destroyers, nuclear missiles, all of that. And so it doesn't take much for somebody to spoof or jam a GPS signal. And, we could, like, time could be the start of World War III. So there's some sobering thoughts to carry with us. And I suppose we're kind of on that gateway to abstract time now. And maybe Paul and Max, you want to say something about how we kind of segued from, like, clocks, watches, sun and water timekeeping to the kind of electronic and the abstract domain.
Yeah, sure, man. Okay, cool. So, I mean, as the kind of, I suppose kind of, continuing on from the brief history of, I suppose you could say, like, pre-digital time that you just gave us, Wasim, the beginning of digital time, or this is something that we were trying to essentially kind of like explicate in the piece of writing that we have in the source book, that actually the architecture, I suppose the architecture of digital time, like original digital time, pre and post Y2K time, was very much like a continuation down this road of the kind of like reification of control that you were just kind of describing, that you went from well, actually there's two ways in which it diverges. Essentially, there's the time that kind of also relies on the calendric as well. So, obviously people, if you're looking at something like farming, something like this, the actual hours of your day are also massively dictated by the season that you're working in, just by either natural light or just the weather or whatever. Whereas the time of, I suppose, the time of the Industrial Revolution, which was then the time of having clocks in every town, beginning to have clocks in factories, stuff like this, was a breaking down of time from the calendric to just, you have 8 or 10 hours. Actually more than that, because workers' rights for 8-hour days was way later than that. But you know what I mean? It became these kind of qualitatively identical units of time that kind of started coming around with the Industrial Revolution. And then as soon as you started having digital time, this was essentially just a continuation of this, where instead of having a central clock in a town that everyone set their watch by, you have something called time servers, which are basically servers that ping atomic clocks. And then when your computer network or your laptop comes online, it pings a time server, and the time server tells it what time it is. And that's how everything stays in sync. And the architect, like the power distribution in that kind of architecture is, quite evidently unilaterally, time is flowing downwards from a central point. And in more practical terms, the only people that control atomic clocks are governments or government-funded institutions. Whereas the kind of machine time that we were trying to, that we were basically starting to explore in kind of all stages of the Temporal Secessionism project, which has lasted for a couple of years now, we were basically trying to look at the type of time that comes out of systems like decentralized or distributed software systems. So how time is essentially produced in these kind of decentralized environments according to consensus mechanisms. And maybe this is a good time to just give a preset of like, what is consensus and why do we need it? At least how we want to talk about it here. And essentially, do you want to? Yeah, okay, cool.
So consensus systems, that's my like jump in. So essentially you have the question like how do you like synchronize like a database, or how do you synchronize various like computational actors in a space? And there are like various methods, and a lot of these methods were actually like born out of like command and control infrastructures which were there in the like 70s, 60s and so on, that you have these kind of software systems which was essentially, I think what Max described as like time servers, which would just like ping certain kind of units of whatever to other actors, and this would be like the mode of synchronization. But this is kind of obviously bound to fail as soon as you have this kind of like routes not working. So as soon as like the communication is breaking between these kind of systems, you don't have a distribution of data or distribution of even like something simple like a timestamp. So the something which I think comes more out of a research into distributed systems, which I think has also like a history. I mean, we didn't go that much into this, but I think it also has a history in kind of like a quite military background of like how do you actually design systems which are fail safe to certain things. So this is, I think, one of the first kind of levels of implementation you would have, that you would have systems which are essentially distributed in a sense that like the consensus or the kind of data is shared between them in a more like a peer-to-peer fashion rather than in a kind of hierarchical kind of question of, okay, the data is distributed. And then the second step, or the kind of additional kind of layer on top of this, is the question what happens when you would have also actors in the system which are essentially could be dangerous or could be essentially want to corrupt the system in a sense. And this is like then I think what brings us to essentially the kind of first idea of like Bitcoin, which is which Vasim, you can also maybe talk a little bit more about, like the first kind of like consensus algorithm of proof of work, which essentially makes sure that like a certain like computational power needs to go into this consensus to kind of like make the whole system fail safe. And I think this is what we describe as Byzantine fault tolerant in a sense.
Yeah. Before I pass over to Azim, it's also that you're not just making it resilient, you're also producing time, because it's a method by which a node is selected to literally produce history from the perspective of the network, which are also just machine nodes, which then kind of brings us to this maybe interesting cusp of moving from a very human-oriented time, no matter how refined and precise according to an atomic clock, to maybe a more abstracted or a more non-human kind of scale of how time is actually represented in networks. And I think with that, maybe I'll pass to you, Wasim.
Sounds good. Before we go down the Bitcoin avenue, I thought we'd like open the floor, see if anybody else has any comments on the either historical side of time, how that's implicated with power and control, or this kind of like atomization, gradation of time, the increase of precision, and how that affects our lives and so on. Feel free to jump in. Go ahead, Anna.
It's like now I need to figure out how to lower my hand. Yeah, hi everyone. I kind of deal with I was thinking about the GPS stuff you were talking about. And in my PhD, I basically have to research how the GPS technology was born in the military, like essentially in the wars of the 20th century. And what I find interesting and what I wanted to kind of broadcast here as an idea to start the conversation. So on the one hand, right, GPS as a usable technology became available only in 2000s. Before 2000s, the precision of GPS did not allow to effectively use it at any point because the precision was somewhere around like tens of meters, which rendered it utterly useless, which didn't mean that there were location or essentially time location technologies used in the military space, but those time space machines were much more localized. They didn't aim for the planetary scale, time location. So what I find interesting in that, right? So we have this kind of like 90s, 2000s turn to the global GPS system on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have a lot of critical theory in 90s started talking about annihilation of space and time. So I wanted to bring this kind of connection of the relationship between time and space in this turn in critical theory, and relationship between time and space in GPS and like new rise of time satellites. Yeah, just the point for everyone to respond.
Go ahead, everyone. Floor is yours. Go ahead. Don't all rush at once. Okay, great, Amy. Yeah, go ahead.
Question to Anna. What do you think, like, based on the research and the work that you've been doing, do you think that we're heading to back, like, sort of towards space being more important in the way that time is distributed now? Is that kind of where this is taking you?
Yeah, I find it interesting. I mean, I kind of propose for this meeting 2 texts that I think are relevant for this question that is bothering me. And one is obviously Virelia's Speed on Politics, where Virelia talks a lot about this particular kind of acceleration and the speed as the new logistical regimes allow for. So, but on the other hand, I find it very interesting how actually like during pandemic, we all kind of had to face the reality of time and space being very far from collapsing on each other. So I think we're now in a very intriguing turmoil of how those two are going to develop like their relationship, and if the time is going to be more like of an area for struggle than space, for instance, like if the time is going to be the new like fight, or like the new aim we're fighting for, or like the new kind of like as like factory was back then, or is it going to be like the new turn to space? I don't know. What do you actually think? I'm wondering.
Well, I just think it's a really interesting question, and also the way that you're like posing it is like, you know, in these really deep philosophical terms, because like the history in Western philosophy anyway, like there's very different stories and different cultural histories of different philosophies. But in Western philosophy, and I think if you guys, I think have been reading, or at some point in the past, I know that Paul and Max had a reading group on of Anna Greenspan's Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine. And she narrates this kind of story really clearly at the beginning of that. So all the way through Western philosophy, there's this kind of tension between whether time or space is used to found or to ground time. So like all the way up to Kant writing the Critique of Pure Reason in the 18th century, the story of time is based on space. And this goes all the way back to like Plato's Timaeus, where time is like the demiurge, like who is the craftsman of the universe, is kind of tasked with creating the best possible copy of the like Platonic universe, which doesn't exist in time, it's eternity. So by creating our universe, the demiurge is kind of working with this like less than ideal material, and they have to make a kind of functional world that brings the decay and change of objects into play, but still is kind of rational enough to be a good copy of the original model. So you get this whole, it like brings in all of these things that get sort of a theological spin on them later on, like the kind of like the original and the copy, or the perfect form and the fallen reality. And it's all based on the kind of movement of the planets. And the idea is that we measure time. I thought this was interesting in Wasim's intro. So talking about the history of measuring time. But like, what does that mean to measure time? That's kind of presupposing that time already exists. And that's what happened in this spatial model of time. Time is kind of like a way of measuring the movement of things in space. So there's already this thing that exists out there. Time is secondary to it, and it's the way you represent it in all of the different ways that that's possible. And so what Kant did was like, I don't know how like much you guys have read all this stuff. If anyone wants, I can like later maybe do, like if it's useful, like a bit more of an explanation of what Kant does. But he basically flips this over to say that time is prior to space, and that we actually produce time, humans produce time through our experience of space, determined by our concepts of objects in a more or less complicated way. But the main thing is that now time is prior to space. So all kind of measurement is a way of producing objects rather than measuring something that's already existing. And then this gets kind of like, sort of Kant marks a big break in Western philosophy, and lots of philosophers come in after and kind of change this in various ways, making it, for some philosophers, more material, so it's not just a mental thing. But basically up until kind of now, and I think blockchains continue this sort of trend by making time the kind of fundamental bedrock of everything else that's produced on a chain, has to come back to the succession of blocks, and you can never ever break that succession. That's how they work. That's the point, right? So there's a kind of Kantian model of time in how a blockchain works as well. So I think this is really interesting, saying, okay, we're in a point now where this model can be put into crisis or questioned, because we also have GPS and this attention to space. And I think it kind of coincides for me, why I think it's really interesting, is that we've got a lot of old models of like originality, authorship, creativity, that especially we developed in like the 20th century, that Web3 in particular is putting into question. Even things that we like thought were really cool and amazing in like the 70s and the 80s and 90s, like infinite replication of material, is now being challenged by like NFTs and stuff like that. So I think there's this weird, interesting tension between space and time that's going on at the moment. So I was really kind of interested in the way that you were like, first of all, you formed it in this kind of like, your like research is kind of working on this distinction between space and time, and this possibility that we're like also hitting a kind of like revolutionary moment where we're moving into a different paradigm or something like that. So yeah. I don't know. Do you like have a like an idea yet of what you think the answer is?
I'm really sorry I have to go now. I messaged on the chat, but thank you very much for the intervention, and thank you for putting up this event. It was really, the 50 minutes we got was very interesting.
Mic drop. Okay, who else? Who else has thoughts? So maybe we say something about time and power before we get to the big bad blockchain bit. Martina, are you there? Like the little discussion we had on the podcast about time and control. I wonder if you would like recap that for us today. I thought that was really good.
I'm here, although actually I was getting really stuck into this super interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Amy and Anna. Because I think there's something in there that's obviously super interesting and obviously quite metaphysically close to impossible to detangle and to come to a super finite conclusion to. But the other thing that was interesting me, and that maybe adds another layer of complexity to that kind of conversation, is that within that kind of ultimate battle between time and space, there's also something to be said about unity, in the sense that that already presupposes like a unity of both time as a unit, and then also space as a unit. And it was really interesting because I think it was Max or Paul, I think it was Max earlier talking kind of running us through the progression and talking about calendric time first, and then obviously this is an oversimplification of what he said, but clock time as a modality to organize labor and industrialize time, and then what comes after, which is like an even higher superstructure in terms of this new computational time and a new abstract form of time. And to me, it seems that these forms of time get kind of piled on top of one another. And there is a point to which it's really difficult to figure out what's the way, what's the order of precedence between different times as well. And that's maybe something within that really interests me, and that I was wondering, Amy, but also obviously anyone else that may have thoughts on this, because it seems to me that even before the entering a conversation about a war between time and space in the order of precedence, there's also a question of which one of the many times wins there seems to be a battle over the times, and which one is the time that wins the primacy. So that's also something that interests me, and I wonder if that's also something that you were thinking of in developing not only one form of temporal secessionism, sorry, I cannot pronounce that, it's like beyond me, and the fact that you produce multiple, and on top of that, the fact that you produced a sort of cheat sheet for everyone else to go in their own directions in that way. And is there an agonism between these times? How do they, what's the order of precedence there, if there is any? Yeah, so it's a very broad question, but I was wondering if anyone had thoughts on that.
Sorry. I mean, with regards to, I think the idea behind temporal secessionism potentially was also, or maybe this is also me retroactively fitting this as a narrative onto this project, but if it is, it doesn't really matter, is of looking at the splitting essentially of time, the kind of siphoning away of stuff that doesn't actually have to rely now on globalized time, right? These networks, these different networks that are kind of springing up, producing their own times, their own flows of time, can or are to a greater or lesser extent actually kind of operating autonomously from each other, right? There's interplays, and they are essentially like nestled on top of each other, but this again is not, there's not like a strict hierarchy there. In a way, it's almost a well, with the secessionism kind of thing, it's a, you know, your own micronation of time, if you want it to be, which will apply to greater or lesser extents depending on, I suppose, you know, on the people or the machines or the interplay of those two things, which is then, maybe also a really nice other like segue into discussions of power now as well, because in a certain way you could also see some of these things as a rejection of the need for like globalized, like the time of globalization, if you don't need it anymore, or you just refuse to rely on it. You know, the network exists outside of it, maybe.
Yeah, or even more generally, Max, just talking about just universalization of time in general.
Yeah.
I had a good point, and it's disappeared from my mind about universalization of time. That's good.
Could I chime in for a minute?
Go ahead.
On that point, I think that we should also not overlook the fact that in this type of secessionism, this type of maybe anti-universalist statement, there's also a grave danger. So for me, it's going back to the mathematician Alfred Korzybski and his idea that what makes humans particularly remarkable is that they're time-binding creatures, and that they are able to build on knowledge sets temporally over time. And I think that there's something of value there when it comes to this kind of succession of time as these sets of knowledge, these epistemic models for thought, for how knowledge is accumulated and how we're able to kind of build on prior generations. And I think that one thing when we get into this kind of anti-globalist, anti-universalist sentiment, that has huge consequences for civilizational narratives when we think of the human species. So I wonder, like, I don't know if it's so easy to say that, you know, having multiple forms in this pluralism is good, because this could also mean a breakage in some of these forms of knowledge that are in fact really important when it comes to the transmission of civilizational possibilities via science, etc.
Oh, and I've remembered the point I was going to make about the universalization of time, which is like, so, you know, we already spoke about Kant. I suppose we could also take one step further back and just say something briefly about Newton as well. So Newton, like for all his sins, and there seem to have been quite a lot, was one of the first to introduce this idea of a universal formalized universal time, time t, little t, in italics, to render formalizable and tractable a lot of, like, problems in physics, maths, natural philosophy back then. And you know, I think I see Newton and then Kant as, you know, being part of a lineage, if we want to think of it in that way. And then what came, you know, much after that, which started to question or to challenge this kind of notion of hegemonically universal time, was firstly relativity. You know, courtesy of Einstein, first in the special and in the general case, which seems to suggest that there is no universal time. Time is lumpy and uneven, and it's only capable of affording partial ordering of events, not a full ordering of everything in the universe gets neatly lined up. And then if you go even a little bit further, like into the quantum domain, first there's like a massive disconnect that's still unresolved between the classical and the quantum formalizations and understandings of entropy. And we can take entropy to be at least somehow related to time. You know, we talk about it as the arrow of time. It may not literally be so, but it seems to be, you know, coincident enough that it has something to do with it. And if you look at the most, you know, freshest current theories in the quantum domain that are investigating gravity. So gravity is to do with like space, density, and mass. But we also know from relativity that gravity has something to do with time. If you throw a clock down a black hole, then the timekeeping of that device is very different than a clock that exists on Earth. And so the cracks that started appearing in the chinks of universal time after Newton and Kant, through to, you know, the relativity cases of Einstein, seem to be quite in tatters now. So I just want to make that point about this kind of this desire for universal time. And now we've ended up kind of almost like, I guess you could think of these networks as kind of patchworks of temporalities. Like they have their own clock, or like, you know, temporal logics embedded within them, and they have, like, to greater or lesser extents, can talk to each other, but they might not be able to, like, you might not say that they're truly commensurate. They'd really be able to resolve each other's time temporalities and logics of time. And I think we're going to come back to that when we talk about the blockchain stuff in a little bit.
Could I?
But yes, go ahead.
I suppose kind of like piggybacking on that, but kind of as a reply to what you were talking about, Nick. This, I think, just in terms of framing it, the kind of like I suppose one of the underlying ideas behind the project of this, like, I suppose, yeah, a certain like anti-hegemonic kind of fracturing of time. This isn't to say that these things are actually all kind of mutually exclusive, right? Like this doesn't. If anything, it's everything actually kind of gets a bit more robust when you break stuff into subsystems that can communicate with each other, right? If we're actually now moving from time dynamics to, I suppose, like power dynamics, or looking at like power structures of networks, be they social or technological or both, as everything actually is. Just because they're actually running on their own metronomes doesn't mean that they can't actually interact. If anything, then sometimes I get what you mean, that there is a certain kind of like base level of knowledge that comes from like a shared, I suppose, as techniques or something like you know, there's a Bernard Stiegler quote on the screen just then. But there's also something actually quite hopeful in there as well, or at least the way that I envisage it, of instead of everything breaking down and everyone kind of blindly, you know, running their own shit, to use a better expression, then it's actually now kind of choice network interactions, as opposed to something to, you know, maybe instead actually having like a global system that has a single point of failure, maybe. So I don't know, maybe that's too you know, cup half full, but at least that's the yeah, I suppose maybe that's my like attempt at like bringing a positivism into the situation you were describing.
Diane, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hi. I mean, I think I just want to chime in a little bit on that note. I in some ways sort of just reiterate it. I think there does seem to be an urgency now that we as sort of thinking sort of sapient beings can access these multiple temporalities, right? We can think through many times. We may not necessarily be able to experience them bodily, you know, because we do have this sort of persistent linear experience of time, but we can understand, we have the capacity to understand time that is, you know, doesn't necessarily operate in the same way that we experience it. And it does seem more and more urgent that we are able to sort of both comprehend, act with, think about, interact with these multiple temporalities. I mean, not least of which would be something like deep time, which we're already impacting enormously, you know, sort of almost unwittingly through fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. But in a way, I think the urgency is sort of getting a handle on the fact that we are already sort of immersed in multiple temporalities and in fact acting in multiple temporalities. So it isn't just this sort of one sort of time that's going to be sort of dominant or something. It's sort of it already is this multitude, and I think all the better for it, in a way that we can sort of get a handle on these multitudes.
Go for it, Nick.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, just to say that my comment was more about, sorry, kid trying to do bedtime. It's not necessarily that these multiple forms of time or this form of secession is inherently bad, quite the opposite. It's more that one can't think it as inherently good, or that if one is to deal with multiple forms of time, one also needs to think about multiple forms of transmission, right? Because it's not just time, it's what carries over time. And I guess my concern is when there's a success, like this idea of succession and alternatives, what are we exiting from, and where are the lines of transmission when it comes to the knowledge and the kind of processes that are built over time and in these kind of epistemic traditions? Are those being broken? And if so, why? And if so, how are these multiple forms of these epistemic conditions that are produced through these successions able to be interoperable? I mean, this is very like top level, but just to say that it's just more about this concern, like exit's not enough. That's a pretty inadequate form of understanding. What's much more important, I think, is why we exit, for what reason, and which way we can still interact.
All I can chime in on with that is that interoperable epistemology is a stunning phrase that I need to try and use somewhere. But yeah, I otherwise completely agree with you, Nick.
I was happy to hear the soundtrack of Capitalism's Transcendental Bedtime Machine in the background, Nick. And Alice, do you want to say something?
Amy might have wanted to chime in first if you have an immediate thought. Okay, I was going to talk about ghosts and grieving time. And yeah, I was really resonating with Diane, what you're talking about, these different modalities. And you said something about embodiment and our experience of time. And I'm curious about that and thinking about that from different from a decolonial approach, right? Nick is talking about what are we breaking down then? If exit is not enough, which I also agree, then what are we building for? What are we reviving? And I'm interested in that sort of relational structuring of time, or time as myth making. And it feels that, you know, in thinking about the linear time that we've been talking about, and time as power, from a decolonial approach, it's left out a lot, right, over the course of Western dominance. And yeah, and I think about like in my body, in my experience of grief practices, which I'm based in the US, and we, in, you know, general culture and societal norms, sweep all of that under the rug. There is no time for that. There is no protocol for that. And we're supposed to move on immediately. And so, you know, and actually, so my dad passed away when I was in college, and I've been kind of reinventing creating altars, you know, to reconnect. And it does truly, like in my body, feel like nonlinear time, and feel like cycles, and kind of like I'm passing through to meet him where he used to be, and be here in a very present space, like spatial, like expansive way, right? And he is also present in where I am right now. And I'm speaking about all of the right now in very abstract terms. But I do want to generally like welcome and embrace and bring in, yeah, like our day-to-day experience, our relational experience, the power of myth making and world making that is really, that feels like really important kind of colloquial work that this moment is calling on us to do. And that is reinventing new models, as well as bringing in longstanding traditions.
Alice, one interesting thing that came up when I was reading about the history of timekeeping is that, so as I said earlier, a lot of the earliest water, oh, you might, I'm not sure if you were here, a lot of the earliest water clocks were found in the East, in the Far East, and lots in China. And they're basically kind of like, you know, like a mill, you know, so it's kind of like, it's a cyclical time that this thing is recording. The wheel is going around and the, you know, water is driving that. Whereas the first mechanical clocks we had in the West were, I mean, like, sure, the face of the clock is circular and that implies cyclicality, but essentially behind the scenes you've basically got two weights just falling under gravity. So it's kind of like you've got this kind of like, it's literally linear time versus linear timekeeping modes versus circular and cyclical timekeeping modes. And I think there's a little bit of a parallel to the way that different cultures see time as well.
Yeah, I was also thinking about candles and the fire coming down, and in traditional Chinese timekeeping, right, we would kind of mark the candle per hour. But it's interesting, like when you think about fire, right, there is something like, you know, we then think toward like expiration or death, and there's something like at the surface very linear about that. But then we get into composting and you know, not all energy is lost, or no energy is ever lost, that sort of thinking. And then it gets me into actually like reincarnation and our bodies, like thinking about apocalypse time, right? Like what is the cyclical time in the sense of a lifetime? And yeah, and where do we go from there when we think about powers that are in this larger ecosystemic you know, shifting that is happening, and yeah, when we become something else.
Catherine, I wonder if you've got a good enough connection to speak to cyclical temporalities in relation to astrology.
Let's try.
Yeah.
I've been having some technical difficulties, but can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, just fine, just fine.
Lovely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about the kind of decolonial perspective, because I think a lot of my work in astrology, like I'm mostly interested in, I don't know, this sort of conception of it and the kind of deep history ties where astrology and calendar making are the same thing. And so it feels like it's more of a kind of crossroads with modernity in that sense. Yeah, I mean, thinking about the bodily experience of time as well, because this is sort of kind of the conceit about timekeeping with the sun and the moon. I mean, among other celestial bodies, but that it's a certain type of lived experience that has to do with objects in space that do, I think even from a non new age vibes perspective, like you have an experience of the sun, it affects you in a type of way, the food you grow is affected by this. So yeah, there's a certain bodily connection there as well. I mean, even things about interesting research on the moon and water, and the way that plants respond via the water, their water content to lunar cycles and realities, and then potentially other kinds of things with water in them, like us. Yeah, I'd kind of made a few little notes about this prior. In the
Before you jump into those, Catherine, I'm reminded of the etymology of the word lunacy, which I didn't know until quite
absolutely.
recently.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
tell us about that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's lunar, right? Lunar lunacy. I think basically just the effects of the moon. And I think would be most closely associated with the full moon. Records of sleeplessness, right, during full moons, or a sense of, kind of frenzy. So, which might lead one to be sort of driven mad by the moon, to become a lunatic.
So people in cryptocurrency are always screaming "when moon," but perhaps they should be careful what they wish for.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the I mean, this is kind of my question about these sort of like timekeeping things, and also, I think from my perspective, I'm like, it as already, if you would like to have less unified time or decentral time, I think that exists inside of old ways of timekeeping. I don't really think it needs to be, I mean, I think you can't you can't live in the deep past, but I think that there's something interesting about these types of, the sort of descendants of this calendar making, which only interestingly lived more through this sort of symbology, symbol systems, more than they do through the actual pragmatics of what that calendar is. But that being particularly in vogue and of interest, both integration, of interest in both.
We're losing you a bit, Catherine. We're losing you.
No worries. Let you go.
All right.
I'll let me go.
Yeah, thanks very much, though. That's awesome. So I've got a bit ready. Like, if we want to segue into the kind of the most linear time ever, the blockchain time, we can do that. If anybody else wants to say something on the like decolonial, non-linear temporalities, now would be a good time. Go ahead, Diane.
It's actually more of a segue into the blockchain stuff. It was I sort of put a question that I think was probably not very clear over in whatever the other platform you put up, about, because of this sort of persistent linearity of blockchain time, then it's got to be like one thing after another, as I understand it. Can like the concept of space-time, is that at all relevant in any way to this? I mean, because you still have like objects in space, right, that change, but maybe it's just because a scale issue, and it's not at all relevant. But I guess I just wanted to throw that out there because it sort of loops back to what we were talking about earlier around sort of primacy of space or time, and then when you get back to blockchain, it is so sort of unrelentingly linear. Yeah, I just sort of want to see if that made any sense, or it's just.
I think it's a great jumping off point, Diane. Thanks for reminding me. I saw the comment, but we weren't quite ready to jump into it. So I can't remember who was talking about this, but somebody was talking about blockchains being a way or a means of respatializing time. So we spoke about, like, time and space having this kind of big, division through various schools of Western thought. And then some people see things like Bitcoin and the blockchain as ways of producing time, manufacturing time, or chronogenesis or chronaissance. Some hot takes I've heard recently. But yeah, one of the nice ways of thinking about it is to bring space and time back together, but inside this walled garden, or within the network I view, so that you've got these kind of like batches of time, and they're being kind of like extruded over, I guess, like unidimensional space. Like you could think of like that arrow as an arrow of space as well as an arrow of time. I'm really curious to hear if anybody else has got thoughts on that.
Like, in a way, they kind of, like you said, they collapse space and time together, in the sense that the way, I don't know, I'm gonna keep drawing on this kind of distinction of like non-blockchain but digital time and then blockchain time. So there's these two forms of like digital infrastructure time, basically. And it's interesting the way that kind of existing digital infrastructure time works, because it has to take into account the fact that a time server is maybe 200 miles away, and so you have to take into account stuff like network latency and physical constants like the speed of light, right? However small the change, you actually have to kind of there needs to be some kind of calculation in there to account for the fact that these two things are actually further apart from each other. But then when you actually have time being kind of produced as as these blocks of like actions that did or didn't happen, then in a way it kind of like negates the need to actually account for space, or at least it kind of despatializes it so I'm not sure whether despatialization or just the absolute collapse of both of these things, two things into each other, is how to properly describe it, but there is some kind of condensation of both of them there.
Can you just say again at what point space is not important in that? Like, because I understand why space is important in terms of like the speed of light and signals and that sort of thing, but can you just say again why it becomes unimportant?
I suppose it becomes unimportant when you're having a metric of time, or like having history as being constituted of these blocks, that where the ordering of these blocks actually isn't necessarily to do, consensus is a question of how do we work out what transactions happened in what order, and that order is not actually predicated on the fact that the transactions hit all of these different nodes in a particular order, but it actually, with something to say with proof of work networks like Bitcoin or Ethereum, it's who paid the most gas and actually was included and mined first, right? So it's like a different way of ordering that actually negates the need to account for stuff like network latency, versus if you were just kind of pinging a website and whoever pressed a button on a website first, whatever, I don't know, won a Bitcoin. So
hey Max, do you want to
negate space there?
Max, do you want to say something about the Google timekeeping system, Spanner, and then I can start talking about blockchain time.
Or Paul, do you want to talk about Paxos?
I mean, yeah, Google has essentially a timekeeping system, which is quite complicated. So I will just like explain a little bit about the less complicated version of it, which is like Paxos, which is kind of like a consensus algorithm. And the interesting thing here is essentially it's kind of it almost like mimics a democratic process in a sense. So it's essentially you have various nodes in a network. And these nodes essentially sending votes to each other that they want to become the leader, right? And these kind of like votes are like working on like certain like kind of timing, though they all start at like 1 second and they all send this out to each other. And through kind of the, in this case, actually through kind of like the space, so through kind of like how long this transaction is taking and so on and so on, they actually elect sort of like a leader in terms of like who has the most votes. And then this kind of node is essentially describing or kind of like making the consensus and kind of says, okay, this goes into the database. So this is in a sense a kind of really kind of spatial kind of way of like keeping time or keeping like consensus in this network. But this is quite, they are quite Byzantine fault tolerant in a sense that as soon as you have like a bad actor in this network, you can just like essentially become leader all the time and corrupt the database. So yeah, this might be like a good way of like contrasting this to something which would be more like Bitcoin or like networks which are yeah, essentially don't have this problem of yeah, or don't have this necessity. Yeah. Basim, do you want to switch, tell something about Bitcoin?
Sure, but first Nick's got his hand up, so let's hear from Nick.
Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment thinking about space, maybe in another way, particularly with Bitcoin, and thinking about how especially the whole network was affected by new rules in China about mining. And so while the inner technology was not itself mandated by a spatial element, there was this whole spatial aspect of geopolitics that did play a very strong role in how the network was oriented and who was able to access it and what type of mining, what type of computational might was available and how centralized it was. So maybe we have to think about it in the broader sense to get this spatial dimension, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I think...
Oh,
sorry. Yes, I think that's a really good point. And I think when we talked about, I think specifically when Max talked about spatial, we were talking mostly in terms of like how the technology is interpreting like latency between like different nodes and how these kind of latencies are essentially like interpreted and how these are like then transformed into a sequenced order of blocks essentially. And I totally agree that there's another notion of space and temporality, which is really much related to the actually material which is used to mine, but also to produce this consensus. I totally agree. Yeah.
Laura, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I also wanted to say something about the relation between, like, I agree with Nick that definitely there is a spatial, like, geopolitical component to these networks, but I was also reflecting on what Max just said. It is like depending on how much gas you pay determines the order of transaction. So there seems like a much clearer or like more direct relation between time and capital, or it's not like space that against which time measures itself, but it's like more directly maybe a function of resources inputted into the system. So yeah, just that, like, I think it's like qualitatively different than yeah, the current ways of measuring time still.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'm also getting a bit of deja vu because I've had to put up the slides from the last Salon, from the Bitcoin ideology Salon. And this is one of them, which is the hash rate of Bitcoin, the amount of computational resource going into defending the network that proof of work is gobbling up. And this isn't even as far back as the graph goes. This is 2015. So this is actually like already like just the second half of Bitcoin's lifetime. And you can see that was basically at the baseline. And yeah, it's a wild graph. It's one of the only graphs that increases faster than the price of Bitcoin. And I picked out these 3 boxes. I just want to quickly mention them because, as we said earlier, we hinted at earlier, real world events have an effect on how much energy goes into the Bitcoin clock. I guess we'll just say something about what's called the difficulty adjustment before we go too much further. So in Bitcoin, like there's a target of to receive a block, the distance, the cadence between the 2 blocks of 600 seconds, of 10 minutes. And the way the network adjusts to target this, it's actually the only real adjustment to the outside that Bitcoin has and is capable of, is this thing called the difficulty adjustment algorithm. So every 2 weeks, the network readjusts the probability of finding a block, of winning the lottery that is proof of work, based on the amount of resource that went in, the amount of computational resource went into the mining in the previous 2 weeks. So say the hash rate doubled, then the probability would halve of each individual hash, that lottery ticket, winning. So the clock stays relatively constant at around 10 minutes. And because of that, there's no satiety to the Bitcoin network. So it would never have had enough energy. So it always just wants more. If you give it more energy, then this calibration thing scales up, and then it just wants more energy. So the 3 red boxes here, I think, are quite interesting because they show large real-world fluctuations in the energy going into this thing, and also therefore by implication the reliability of the clock that it instantiates. And until recently, there used to be this kind of like weird nomadic tendency in Bitcoin because of the energy markets. The energy markets are around the world, they're heterogeneous. So one unit of energy in one place is not necessarily the same price as the others. So what would happen is twice a year, a lot of the mining was in China till quite recently. In the summer, in the south of China, there is a bunch of dams. And so like they would get basically almost free hydropower from these dams. Then the wet season would end and they would literally unplug all the machines, put them in trucks or whatever, drive them to more mountainous areas where they've got cheap coal, and just power through the winter with dirty coal. And so these fluctuations you were seeing until recently were actually literally miners getting unplugged, driven across the planet and plugged back in somewhere else where the energy is cheaper. And the thing on the very right, this much larger decline, was, as we said just now, was due to some fairly heavy-handed regulation in China, which didn't quite ban the mining in total, but they've thrown out a lot of the miners, so they've gone to other countries now. But I think that is a story for another day. I just wanted to leave you with some of the mental images of these pictures of mining rigs and factory farms, mining farms on fire, getting flooded because they end up in areas of extreme weather and climate. And on the right, in the bottom, those are empty, like abandoned mining farms in various parts of China. And yes, Diane, do you want to jump in?
It was just a question. Do you know if things like lockdown restrictions had an effect on this?
Had effect on the mining?
Yeah.
I actually don't think so, because it's almost a completely automated process. There's so few humans involved in this. It's actually one of the big bugbears in it. So what will happen is you'll see these news articles all the time these days. Blah, blah, blah country opens its door to Bitcoin miners. At the moment, it's Kazakhstan. So they all left China and a whole bunch went to Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan was like, hey, we've got energy. They can just come here. And they go there and they think the Kazakh government thinks they're going to get loads of like economic activity, jobs, whatever. What it is like, one guy shows up, plugs in 10,000 machines, and he just sits around waiting for them to break, and then he puts the fixed one back where the broken one was. So this thing doesn't really, it doesn't need that many humans, which is an interesting thing in itself. So I don't think it was that lockdown affected really. More by the energy markets, more by the fluctuations of the energy markets. So maybe I'll do a little bit on block time, on blockchains and stuff. Yeah. So I wrote an article for the Time Zone 04 publication that Max and Paul were introducing earlier, which has loads of great stuff in it, like by Amy, Kia, the interview with Anna Griesman, Paul and Max, and Johannes designed that. So that's looking great. Can't wait to take a good look at that. And in there, I was trying to, the version that we've got in that source book is so short that I couldn't draw the full link between like history of science and philosophy to these networks. But I was trying to kind of plot a course between like the studies of time in the past and like what the weird things that we can see in these blockchain networks. So I'm just going to read you a bit from the blurb, from the abstract, which I think kind of encapsulated where I was trying to go with this. And it's also like it speaks to some of the things we've already said. So cryptocurrencies are time-stamping systems at their core. A discretized linear data architecture, sometimes known as the time chain, provides a reasonable degree of assurance that the network will respect a particular set of transaction orderings, which when chained together manifest a canonical historicity. The transcendental mechanism known as proof of work leaderlessly transmutes imminent continuous network activities into ordinarily sequenced batches of confirmed transactions. As a byproduct of this process, temporal paradoxes are encoded in the beating heart of cryptocurrency network logics. And this combination of the temporal polities that hold sway within these networks, latent temporal polities, and these temporal paradoxes from this kind of discontinuity between the continuous time network activities and the discrete time of the blockchain clock lead to unexpected consequences, as what I've called chrono bandits run wild in the dark forests of the time chain. And so what we were trying to do was get a conceptual model for why we see these weird temporal goings on in blockchain systems. And I think one of the things that's most interesting is like how the clock works in something like Bitcoin. Because as we said, Bitcoin is a decentralized network. There's no authority in it. There's no person or entity saying, this is the news, these are the facts. Everything has to be done by consensus, essentially, as we said, like, kind of network-wide agreement. And there's no clock. There's no like Earth time clock inside Bitcoin. And so the way that Bitcoin interfaces with the time of the outside world, of human time, the Gregorian calendar 24/7, 365, is by the miners, people engaging and burning all of this energy to try and win this thermoeconomic lottery that is the proof of work. They submit timestamps with the blocks that they propose, candidate blocks, to go in the blockchain, or the time chain, if you prefer that term. And but there's nothing to stop a miner from submitting an inaccurate timestamp. It could be early, it could be late. Some of the networks have a tolerance for how inaccurate a timestamp that they'll be willing to accept. And in Bitcoin, it will accept a deviance of up to 2 hours, 120 minutes, which is approximately 12 times the average length of time between a block. And there are attacks that people can do that are based on like feeding inaccurate timestamps to try and game this difficulty adjustment thing that I mentioned earlier. Because if you can game the difficulty adjustment down, that means you can do less work to get the rewards, right? So that's obviously very attractive from a kind of adversarial, economically rational mindset. And one of the mitigations inside Bitcoin to try and ameliorate this potential situation with inaccurate timestamps is the use of a rolling average of timestamps. And it's called median time passed, or MTP. And so in Bitcoin, the actual monotonic clock, right, in terms of as it's measured by Earth time, is MTP. So it's the median, one of the averages of the timestamps of the last 11 blocks. And a new block must always have a timestamp greater than this trailing average of MTP. So this is one of the ways that Bitcoin makes sure that the arrow of time keeps going in the same direction, essentially. And I think one of the other things we should say while we're talking about blockchain time, before we go too much into the weeds, is the timestamps themselves that these miners are feeding, that Bitcoin is passing to make making this temporal average for this monotonic clock that it has in it. They're run off the Linux timestamping system, which is like a series of 32-bit integers. It's just a string of numbers, basically, that started on the 1st of Jan 1970, which is another interesting point about creating time. Like, somebody decided that 1st of Jan 1970 is when Linux time starts. That's the birth of server time or computer time or whatever, in some sense. But because this 32-bit integers, that is a limited amount of data that those can hold, and this is just incrementing up by it's incrementing up by 1 every second. So essentially, this will run out of time with the Linux timestamping system if they're signed integers. Then we run out of time in 2038, 68 years after the Linux clock started. And that's why you hear people talk about the 2038 problem now. And they're not talking about it very loudly yet, but people are talking about it as a kind of a new Y2K. It's another integer overflow error. Y2K was an integer overflow where 1999 was just written as 99. And then when 99 becomes 0, that's a problem for computers who are expecting something to be incrementing monotonically. Whereas this 32-bit timestamp is much longer, but it will do the same thing. It will run out of time and go back to 0, and that will screw a lot of things up. So Bitcoin doesn't actually use the 32-bit signed Linux timestamping system. It uses the unsigned one, which means that Bitcoin runs out of time in 2106. It's got another 68 years before it's toast. And you can imagine that there'll be some kind of upgrade, despite how hard it is to upgrade Bitcoin. I don't think it'll be that controversial to upgrade the timestamping system in Bitcoin at some point in the next 85 years. I think that's probably quite possible. And so I'll pause there because that was just like quite a lot of blockchain stuff. And there's another set of interesting things where we might look at the cases where these things have been tried to be leveraged and exploited out in the wild. But first, I want to open it up for comments. Do you want to throw me a bone, Paul and Max? I'm sure you have thoughts about block time.
Yes. Yeah, I think there are some like quite dense points in there. One thing I find like quite interesting is this idea of like the difficulty level, which is like adjusted through like the protocol itself. So it's in a way sort of like an almost like immanent system, which is sort of like running just on itself, right? And is calculating these kind of like the level which or the amount of work which is needed to actually proceed further, essentially. And I kind of find it with Bitcoin always interesting, this kind of question of essentially sort of like dry and wet code in a sense, right? What is like implemented in a protocol, like what things are like there on like a protocol level and they're like really hard coded almost, and what things are more almost like socially constructed around the protocol, but still people like use these things as if they were still like in the sort of protocol level integrated. And I think that is sort of an interesting, or this kind of leaves a little bit like kind of discussion for like, at what level like protocols are also just like socially mediated all the time, because as you said, like someone has to like change this this integer overflow bug at one point, right? And like even if you say, okay, that's like an autonomous system and so on, it still needs like core devs or someone like who actually like push the thing and kind of incentivize other people to run it. So it kind of makes clear that all of these systems are quite like still like social systems, I think.
Yeah, I think we call this decentralization theater, right? From the outside, it looks like it's this kind of like, completely autonomous system. It's just a bunch of cogs whirring and it will go until the end of time. But you get a bit closer, you realize it's actually a bunch of humans that have the commit access to the Bitcoin core repository, or that sit on the Bitcoin dev mailing list, arguing or discussing the merits of various technical parameters. Something just got locked in as an upgrade on Bitcoin, actually, called Taproot, which allows some additional scripting functionality, which Bitcoin really needs. And they did it as a soft fork, which means it's like an optional upgrade. So if you don't upgrade your software, you're still on the network, everything's fine. You just don't see some of the extra data, but nobody's changed the rules so that one set of nodes are no longer compatible with the other. And I was just thinking, like, people like Larry Lessig talk about, the difference between rules and norms. And it sounds kind of like, when we've got these quite hard protocols, that even some of the norms around them become quite hard. Like they become almost like, adjacent to the protocol, or like almost pseudo protocolized. And there's something in there about the social contract as well that I think we can get to a bit later. It's really interesting in these networks. But there's one thing that I know we discussed it in the podcast. I think it's interesting to bring up again, is that in the Bitcoin space for years, they've been talking about this idea of an intersubjective consensus between the computers running the code and the humans enacting the changes, upgrades, stewarding the network and so on. And so it seems to me like even the most like ideologically fervent Bitcoiners will admit eventually, under duress, perhaps, that this is actually a human story, and that this is like a feedback loop, and the humans are keeping the protocol in check, and the protocols is keeping the humans in check. But then that starts to raise questions about, like, which one, where is the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, or where's the chicken and where's the egg? Yeah, and there's another interesting thing I wanted to go into, which is more on the kind of case studies of the thing that I wrote. But before we get there, I think there's some other like interesting morsels in there if anybody wants to jump in.
Does anyone want to throw in? Yeah, I mean, sorry, Paul, could you move your? This is the problem of doing stuff in IRL space. Microphones get caught on things. Yeah, I mean, I suppose where the tail wags the dog is an interesting question of. It's an interesting question, and maybe like a more maybe only an interesting question insofar as to say that like these networks that we're talking about as these kind of transcendental time machines, right? These things that like happen to time. Actually, wait, I've completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I had a good point. I'll come back to it. Sorry.
Hopefully it comes back in time.
Who knows? Just a brain fork, that's why.
So Gary Zhang joined us a little bit late. And I know he has thoughts about, Alice has got her hand up. Yeah, Alice, jump in.
I have a question about earlier in the discussion, we brought up the military roots of command and control, and we also mentioned Byzantine fault tolerance. And I'm curious about, you know, the unfailability or like the fail-proof goal here of it's interesting thinking about like the decentralization of the way that blockchain works in conjunction with like the centralization ideal of a timekeeping system. And I'm curious of the like connection there with the military undertones that this may have been built off of from the get-go. So I wonder if anyone has thoughts on that.
I mean, are you kind of asking about the, I suppose, like the practical history of where this came from with regards to the military application, or?
Like how to understand that in conjunction with just where we're going today and the idea of a central, like machine ran time system.
I think there's something interesting to say in very general sense that the Bitcoin network, especially Bitcoin, has this incredibly defensive outlook, viewpoint. It's basically like the whole network is architected around the fact that it's more expensive to attack it than it is to defend it, and that you have like the absolute minimum possible, like, well, that's the idea, to done minimum possible trust requirements of like the level of trust you have in any of the other nodes on the network. So this idea of like the Byzantine general and the Byzantine node is basically, I mean, like, I'll just very briefly explain it. That the idea is that there's a city and there's a bunch of generals with their encampments around it. And the idea is that at every dawn, they either attack or they don't attack. And they have to pass messages across to the generals. As long as they all attack at the same time, they succeed. If only some of them attack and some of them don't, they fail. But some of the generals might be spies or traitors. And so they can pass messages around, but you don't always know that you can trust the other members of the group. And so the Byzantine general problem is about like, how can we be sure that we all agree and there's nobody malicious kind of poisoning the well? And so if you build a distributed system on those kinds of logics, you can imagine it's going to come out quite defensive. And the way that Bitcoin solves this Byzantine general's problem in a way that doesn't require a leader or a trusted third party is with this massive expenditure of energy that is proof of work. You know, so that's how we choose a leader that gets to decide what goes in a block, put that on the chain, and that's they've created that little bit of time or time space, depending on how you think of it. But I think because of those things, it has this very and lots of other things, it has this very defensive kind of logic built into it, militaristic defensive logic.
I mean, maybe like I don't know, maybe stretching that. Yeah, maybe I suppose like a counter, not necessarily a counter, but an interesting point, maybe like a meta point regarding that is that, you know, if you think of like Bitcoin is super defensive, but Bitcoin is essentially just like financial infrastructure, right? So all financial infrastructure is actually, it needs to be defensive in some particular way. But then, I don't know, I suppose you could see that like the culture of Bitcoin hasn't necessarily like gone further than that. So it has become this kind of very culturally like defensive island of Bitcoin maximalists who don't necessarily like other things, other chains, other whatevers. And then if you look at like the kind of like the increasing plurality of all of these projects that are essentially building on top of these protocols, that the interesting thing, or at least the interesting thing for me anyway, is to look at what these kind of, what you can build on top of these networks that actually have these roots, have these bases in like, you know, in like game theory, which is like an incredibly antagonistic, obviously very like kind of traditionally economic way of viewing how actors interact in a network, but then saying, okay, cool, well, if you actually have like your base layer of, we can all trust that like no one can steal our whatever we're seeing as tokens of value in this system, that actually can like open the doors to more trusted, I don't know, I'm trying to phrase it properly. Basically, you can, because you can trust in the network, then you actually can trust in people even more on a certain level, like a higher level of abstraction within the network, I suppose. Yeah, which is maybe a point of interest, but also like a weird point of tension, or like, I don't know, a certain kind of contradictory element that you can kind of use these things that rely on such aggressively, you know, homo economicus-esque kind of ways of seeing how people act as nodes in this network to actually achieve situations of far greater trust.
I think it's even worse than that, Max. I don't think it's even Homo economicus anymore. I don't think it's even Homo blockonomicus anymore. I think we're at Homo clockonomicus, and there's possibly no way back. Diane has a comment, I think.
It's going to be quite incoherent, I think, so I apologize in advance. But I guess listening to this, and I think last time, Wasim, you and I talked about this, I keep getting this sort of like underlying sense of like, oh my God, this whole thing needs to be taken down. How can this be taken down? It needs to like, and I mean, I guess I'm asking those of you that know anything about how the structure of it holds, is there any way to corrode this from within? Can we time bomb it in some way? Because it seems like such a terrible idea on so many levels.
It's very hard, Diane. I think this is like one of the biggest problems. It's very hard to kill blockchains. Like that's the first thing. Like, so somebody can just spin up something that's dead. As long as one node decides to start running again, start looking for blocks, however those blocks are found, then it can come back. And the other thing to say is that blockchains don't pivot, they fork. So you can get these kind of schisms. And so even if one set of stakeholders decides that they don't like it anymore, as long as there's a sufficiently kind of well incentivized ideological conservative faction in that set of stakeholders, they can just keep going. So that's what happened in Ethereum 5 years ago when there was a massive schism following a catastrophic technical error, technical failure. And some people just carried on mining a very minority, branch of that network because they believed in it. And that's still going now. It's called Ethereum Classic. So it's very hard to kill them, Diane. I think that's the biggest problem. But I would say that the best thing we can do, I think, is like to engage in discourse and critical debate to push the Overton window out. So one thing I've noticed is that there's now like quite a lot of ecological discussion about the externalities of proof of work and Bitcoin. And now like Bitcoin is for many years we're just kind of like shutting that out and not even giving it paying it any heed. Now they're paying it some heed. So even what you see now is like all of these kind of financial whatever services companies that are building Bitcoin products, they're now doing things like offsetting their carbon, which we could discuss the effectiveness of that another time. But they're trying now to greenwash a bit their Bitcoin stuff, and they wouldn't do that unless they thought it mattered. So now ultimately, the people that do these financial products on Bitcoin, they want mass adoption because they want people to buy these products. But if the customers are saying, well, I don't like this, it's too ecologically expensive or damaging, then they will try to come up with ways that they can change this thing. But I don't think we'll ever see Bitcoin move away from proof of work, or at the very least, if one faction tried to do it, there would be another faction that would stay. So they're actually very hard to kill. And just like a shameless plug here, Diane, I'm halfway through writing a book about proof of work. So if you find any solutions, let me know. The best I've come up with is to talk to people.
Well, I mean, is international regulation, is that totally like an antiquated idea in terms of how these things work? Is that like
Nice
off the
idea,
table?
Diane. It's really nice.
Yeah, okay.
But the problem
All
is
right.
that for every country, if country N bans Bitcoin, there's always country N+1 next door.
Right.
Like what happened with China, Kazakhstan was just like, "Yo, come here," and then like Kazakh was about to throw them out because they've now got blackouts in Kazakhstan, energy blackouts, and so they'll just go to like whatever, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Azerbaijan. There'll always be a place. And now we've got countries that are accepting Bitcoin as legal.
Fine.
El Salvador wants to do volcano-powered Bitcoin mining, and so like I don't think we're going to get rid of it, Diane. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. I take the patronizing tone. It's fair.
No, I'm not patronizing you. No, it's like it's just,
no,
I'm
about
just really
everything.
sad about it. I wish I could have thought up a solution and like implemented it.
Well, we'll task you with that.
I mean, maybe it makes also sense to sort of like kind of distinguish a little bit between like a kind of consensus algorithm in a specific implementation, like proof of work, and like kind of distributed systems in sort of like general, or like blockchain systems in general. I think there is like a slight difference. And when we talk here about that kind of ecological damages and this kind of things, I think they stream more from like sort of certain implementation of consensus algorithms and this kind of like proof of work, rather than necessarily like the whole idea of like having peer-to-peer systems finding kind of just finding consensus essentially. So yeah, I think it kind of makes sense also to maybe distinguish these two things, and look also a little bit into what other kind of systems are doing. And there are like also other options of like consensus algorithms which are distributed, which are distributed and also sort of like safe. For example, proof of stake and all these kind of things which are coming up now, and which don't have this sort of like huge ecological footprint and this direct relation to kind of machinic labor or sort of like energy resource consumption. And I think that's maybe also an interesting sort of point, that like a lot of other systems which are proposed now, like proof of stake, which is essentially a consensus algorithm which works through sort of like staking on certain nodes, and then if these nodes behave essentially bad, or the network is deciding this node is behaving bad, then like the stake gets slashed. So so consensus is then produced essentially by this like staked nodes, but it's still like permissionless. And I found it always quite interesting that I think like the mode of production there is quite different than when we see something like proof of work, where like you actually has to, as Vasim, you said, like win this like thermo lottery, where you have to essentially just waste a lot of money or a lot of kind of capital and labor to produce like consensus, while the other thing is even more like indirect and even more like in a logic of like financialization, where the staking essentially is more related to essentially like models of yield, of producing like yield, right?
Yeah, you've replaced this kind of like a thermodynamic way of reaching agreement with an entirely financialized one. And just to say very briefly to people that we'd say about stake here, we think about like a poker table and your chips, literally like we're talking about coins as your stake. So you're rendering a liquid, a set of your resources, and that the security of the network is meant to come from that sunk cost, in contrast to the sunk cost of the energy being expended in something like proof of work. Remains to be seen, I think, like, you know, over time, to see that these things get computationally and economically tested.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these are also, proof of work as a consensus mechanism is the thermodynamic equivalent of using a sledgehammer for absolutely everything. And, you know, it's proof of stake is a slightly more refined mechanism, and I'm sure in the future the refinement will come. People will work out ways of achieving trustlessness, even though P2P is better than trustless, but that's a totally different kind of
But,
question.
just to say, Max, just remember that there's a paper by Atol, one of the discoverers of the selfish mining kind of like strategy, called Just Enough Security. And he was doing he's a computer scientist doing this kind of theoretical modeling of can we work out how much energy is enough energy for proof of work? Because proof of work doesn't have any kind of chill as in the Bitcoin style. But could we design a system that did know when it had enough? And sure, it's just theoretical models, it's just math. But they came up with a figure, Al and co-workers, that Bitcoin overpays by at least a factor of 2. So we could be using half the energy to get enough security, more than enough.
Yeah, I mean, we're almost hitting the 2-hour mark, so maybe kind of starting to leave it on the idea of someone capping a volcano to make magic internet money is a suitably kind of
explosive place to leave
audacious,
it.
ridiculous kind of thing to leave it on. And one thing that actually in the process of doing our talk, I realized Paul and I didn't do is we're actually going to, all of the stuff that we discussed beforehand will actually be presented on the Plaza Protocol website, which is the project that so kindly put up with us taking over their studio for 2 hours and wanted us to contribute to this project. And yeah, we've both dropped those links in the chat, just so I didn't forget before that.
Yeah, that's plazaprotocol.si for everyone watching later.
Oh yeah, so true. Okay, so if you directly want to see, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to do a live drop of the secret way that you can get in and see the Plaza Protocol presentation of the work. So if Paul, you could share your screen. Yeah, if this doesn't work just because of the heaviness of the website and the fact that we are live streaming it to 20 people, then I'll send instructions to everyone. So this is the loading page of the website. Beautiful. I don't know what's in it. I don't know how. All right. So basically, this is the main page, and yeah, you essentially press the information thing up there on the top right corner. Obviously, it's mirrored left for everyone on the screen, and in the bottom left, you need to put in a seed, and that seed is temporal. You press go, and a little mini map appears. And that little that GIF that kind of looks like the POV of someone who's about to be taken by aliens will take you to our little room. And you should explore all of the other rooms in this site as well. It's wonderful. And here you go. And there's basically a button where you can all download a PDF version of the Temporal Secessionism sourcebook, which Paul is nicely introducing for us. And then the other button will take you to the currently only 4 items, the only 4 NFTs, which is no longer in stealth mode. So maybe we should have changed the description on OpenSea. But yeah, and there you go. That's how you access it. Go on the Plaza Protocol website. It's fantastic. And yeah, sorry for derailing that, but I just realized what time it was.
That's good. I mean, that was kind of the point of the event. So it's good that we got that in there.
Exactly. I got too caught up in thermo-capitalism to properly plug everything.
We're terrible advertisers, but what we can do, Paul and Max and Chatter and everybody else, is we can collect together links and put them in the description of the videos on YouTube and stuff. Yeah. Shall we wrap? Shall we wind it down? It's 9 o'clock. Okay. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's perfect. Yeah, we've been going for 2 hours. That's enough for anybody. Yeah, so thanks very much, everybody, for coming and participating, both on cyberspace and in Ljubljana. We are going to, once we wrap here, we're going to render out the video and put it on. I think it goes on both our website and the Plaza Protocol website. So you just go to zeroxsalon.pubpub.org and you'll see it there. We'll push it out on Twitter and Instagram and all the rest of it. So I hope you had a nice time. This is like the third time we've talked about time, and we seem to get into different nooks and crannies each time. So yeah, let's wrap. So thanks very much again to Paul and Max from Nascent, everybody from Plaza Protocol, from Shum, from Project Atol, from Chasa as well, everyone in Ljubljana, and yeah, see you again soon. Keep watching the clocks.
Brilliant.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.